Hi, Misha here. And if this video seems a bit rushed, I do apologize, but this just came in and I wanted to do something for it. Because aside from the U2 that Hobby Master should be releasing next month, this is one of the ones I was most excited about when I heard they were coming out in 2021. This is from Air Force One. This is a 1/72 scale diecast model of an MQ-1 Predator drone. And in the past, and I probably should revisit it, I did cover another drone that was a Navy. But this is really the most famous one to date, even though it has been replaced in the U.S. Air Force. And actually, I didn't know this was coming before it was announced, but I remember looking on eBay last year, and I saw over in China, Taiwan, they had Air Force One Predators. And I just thought it was an older model that I had missed. And maybe they did release these far in the past, but I bought this from Pete's Collectibles, and when I asked him, he said he couldn't find any evidence, anything in the catalog that he had showing an Air Force One Predator being released here before. So this could be the first time they've done this here. Maybe it just made it over there first, and then because of COVID, it got delayed a year. Regardless, it's here, and it's pretty cool. It's a good size because of being 1/72 scale. I mean, it's very thin, of course, because it's almost a glider, because it's a drone. Propeller moves. And one thing I wasn't expecting, I looked on Flying Mule's website before these came in, and they said they had gear in the down position, fixed down. So when I got it, and it came with gear up or down, that just made me all the more happy. And the gear in the down position, even the tiny little wheels rotate. So that's neat. And it comes with 2 air-to-surface missiles here. And they are removable if you'd rather go for more of a reconnaissance thing. And you got a little tube. I don't know, is that a refueling tube or a pitot tube? But the whole thing is metal. It's thin metal, but that's, to be accurate. Oh wait, this one is plastic. Metal, metal, metal in the body. Sorry, knocked you. And yeah, little svelte propeller. And of course it comes with the typical Air Force One stand, which is actually one of their best features, because it bolts together and it slots in. This one doesn't sit real tight on its stand, but since it's a pretty light model, shouldn't be a problem. We will see, though. As far as the history of the Predator, well, it dates back to the 1980s. Kind of the U.S. military and the CIA were interested in drones. And there was some early work with various prototypes. An early one that I can think of was called Amber. At least the program was called that. And then there was the Gnat. And that was from a company that has one of the coolest names ever, General Atomics Aviation. And the Gnat they were working on in the early 90s, and its main thing was the engine. It was just too loud. It had no stealth capability because, well, it sounded like a helicopter hovering over your house. And plus, remote technology was kind of still in its infancy at that time. But in 1994, in January, the company, General Atomics, was granted a contract to develop the Gnat into something actually useful. And so that July, they began test flying the Predator. And from that point on, through about 1996, it went through a test and evaluation phase and kind of a development phase, because this was not just a new aircraft for the military, but a whole new concept. It was actually first deployed kind of for field testing in the Balkans just under a year after its first flight in July of 1995. And at this time, you have kind of a consortium of different agencies looking at these. You have the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps, and the CIA. And early on in the Predator's life, the U.S. Navy was kind of taking a front seat and kind of pushing things forward. Of course, that would change and directions would go differently. But yeah, it would kind of end its testing phase and slide into full production and remain there for 2 decades, kind of earning quite the name for itself, and sometimes even some infamy. Initially, the Air Force classified this as a Tier 2 male US. That is a medium altitude, long endurance, unmanned system. During the testing evaluation phase, 12 of the new MQ-1 Predators were purchased, and 3 ground stations to operate them. And early on, they pretty much made sure they had line of sight when they were doing takeoff and landings, and they did various controls using satellites and dealing with the delays. These early versions had various cameras, but they were not armed. They were reconnaissance drones only. It wouldn't be until 2000 that the Air Force started considering arming these, and they fitted them with 2 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. You know, like what the Apache uses. So kind of a little tank buster missile. And they would have a first test launching in February of 2001. And then in June of 2001, they had an interesting test against a mock-up of Osama bin Laden's compound. Unfortunately, it was not in service in an armed reconnaissance version before 9/11. At this time, the Air Force had about 60 in inventory, and the new version was known at first as the RQ-1B. That was kind of the first production. Really, the RQ-1A was the pre-production model anyway. And then they decided, since this was a multi-role craft, it would become the MQ-1. It also had a laser designator, either for its own Hellfire or for other friendlies to work with him. And yeah, this is a glider, and it's propeller driven. The idea is endurance, not speed. Its maximum speed is under 140 miles per hour, but it has a cruise speed of not much greater than 80 miles per hour, so, you know, like a fast car. And its maximum altitude is about 25,000 feet. And it's about 27 foot long, and early versions had a wingspan of about 49 feet, but later this would increase to about 55 feet as things would go on. Some of the early problems they experienced, not just with communications, but also icing. It seemed to be pretty susceptible to the cold. They realized this when deploying to Afghanistan and testing in such environments. So later versions would introduce de-icing equipment. And of course, they would update the communications gear with the full production model. But the good thing was, it had very nice endurance. It could loiter over a target for 14 plus hours. Regular mission durations could be up to 24 hours. And with refueling, the longest recorded mission that at least wasn't classified was just a hair over 40 hours for one of these. And as time went on, they became more comfortable operating these from a more remote, further away distance. You had one guy who piloted it, and then you had 2 additional guys on the team. They kind of looked at sensor data, instrument data, just, checking on things. And of course, once we introduced the MQ-1 with its Hellfire missiles, that made things more interesting. And this is when some people got nervous. The whole idea of an armed drone doesn't sit well with everyone. Nevertheless, production and all that would continue. The the Air Force would have about 150 of these in inventory towards the end. Many had been lost, especially early on in Afghanistan, to bad weather or other environmental things. A few had been shot down, of course, by adversaries. One nice thing, it could be taken apart to be easily shipped around. It was modular. I think it could be disassembled into 6 components, something like that, to make it easy. Of course, it had its own surface command stations, centers. And it was used in several places, Iraq, Afghanistan. By 2011, it was starting to get a little dated, though, and there were plans to retire it coming up to about 2015. The last new production model for the Air Force was in 2011, and then the last one made for an Italian contract, I believe was in late 2015, and then the production line would be shut down soon thereafter. And so there were plans to retire the MQ-1 Predator and replace it with the more advanced MQ-9 Reaper. But because of, at that time, recent instabilities in the Middle East, these were kept for reconnaissance for a few years longer. And it wasn't until 2018 that the Predator was finally taken out of U.S. Air Force service. I've been wanting to do a video on the Predator for about a year, and I, at that time, picked up this little model. This is another diecast, but it's from Postage Stamps. Sorry, let me point you the wrong way. There you go. Hey. This is from Postage Stamp. It is metal. Metal wings. Metal tail. Spinning propeller even. But it doesn't have gear up or down. And it does have little missiles. And it's said to be about a 1/87 scale. It's not bad at all for what it is. But I just kind of put off doing the video. It seemed for such a, thing. And I'm glad I did with the, it's going to fight me to put the stand back on. Now that the Air Force One came out, it just seems like a better subject matter with more options. There we go. Of course, this one is a lot cheaper. In fact, let me pick this up here and show you. So this was 172 versus 187. There you go. They're both of the MQ-1. Now, we've been talking about the Air Force. I said at the beginning that the Navy originally was taking charge, but in spring of 1996, the Secretary of Defense reworked things and assigned the Air Force to be in charge. And the Navy kind of dropped away. The Army kept on. In fact, there was a version, the MQ-1C, made for the Army. And the CIA was also interested. Again, originally just used for its cameras and reconnaissance. The first time an armed version was used, not the first time, but yeah, of note would be in March of 2002 when an armed Predator was used actually to provide close air support for soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. And late that year in December, a Predator would actually be shot down by an Iraqi MiG. This was before, of course, the Second War had begun. And when the Second War in Iraq did kick off in March of 2003, these were again in heavy use. The armored version and the reconnaissance version were both in inventory. There would always be more of the recon version General Atomics would produce about 285 of those, compared with about 75 of the MQ-1, but they were still used. One kind of fun thing they did in Iraq, they would fit these with some old Stinger missiles and use them to try to bait and decoy out Iraqi aircraft. And of course, they would use them for a lot of reconnaissance flights over Iraq. They probably saw the heaviest use in the 2005 to 2006 time period. And by this point, a good bit of the equipment had been updated and modernized, and they had better, nearly instant real-time control of these. And by 2009, 2010, the newer MQ-9 Reaper was kind of coming around. But a few other agencies in America kind of looked at this. For one, in 2006, the Federal Aviation gave these permission to fly in civilian airspace in the USA. And they started to be used for search and rescue and other kind of humanitarian type things. And then around 2013, U.S. Border and Customs started flying some drones to, well, monitor borders. And they continued on. They were used in Libya and Syria and anywhere else. Again, the armed version was always a little controversial, but the reconnaissance version, they had very good cameras, not just daylight, but IR and other things. They could do video or still images. And, as I said, they could operate as a laser designator for other aircraft. And while they did lose a number of these to weather accidents and even enemy fire, I'm not going to say these are cheap, but they're far less expensive than a standard aircraft, and you're not risking a pilot's life. That's funny. Very thin wings on that one, for what it is. Take this back off the stand. But it's just been such a iconic part of recent combat, recent warfare. It's really the first successful combat drone in the U.S. military. And it's just seen a lot of use. So I thought it would be a very interesting model. And I am not disappointed. These wings had to be strengthened and reinforced when they started to put the Hellfires on them. As far as I know, the Hellfire and the Stinger were the only armament put on these, but I'm sure I'm wrong. I don't really follow that stuff terribly closely. And the truth is, before I received the postage stamp one here, I didn't know what a Predator looked like. I mean, I knew what it was, but it was a very interesting thing to pick up for the first time. I'd never had one. By the time the Predator was a real-world aircraft, I was no longer a kid and wasn't really buying models, so I just never knew what it looked like before. So which one do you think? Do you think the Air Force One or the postage stamp? Now, there's of course a cost difference. The Air Force One, I just looked on Aiken's website just to gauge. They have this for $49.95. And they also have this one on their website for $14.95. So this is roughly a third the cost. With the postage stamp, you get a stand and a moving propeller, and you get fixed missiles. And like I said, with the Air Force One, you get a stand, moving propeller, gear up or down, even rotating wheels on the gear. And you can display with the missiles on or off at your discretion. Also, it has kind of more of a matte finish to the paint, whereas the postage stamp is a glossy finish. I'm not knocking postage stamp. I actually think they do really well for the money. They are very metal, But they don't have gear up or down. Not all of them have moving parts, and they don't always have concealed screw holes. When you're doing diecast, there have to be screws. Air Force One doesn't conceal theirs as well as some, like Hobby Master, but they do more than the postage stamp. So it's up to you if you think it's worth it. Me, myself, and I. Heck, you only live once. This is neat. I think it's worth having. I think it'll look kind of neat next to the Hobby Master U2 when that's finally out too. They both have long, just kind of glider floating around design. I need to compare this to that X-47 that UCAV. Oh, maybe next time. So let me know what you think of this new model from Air Force One. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And feel free to comment below. This is Misha. And I will catch you very soon next time.